Kind of better.
Good. That's always good to hear.
I didn't sleep last night though.
It'd be like that. But you're here, right?
Yeah.
Ready to get at it. New day. Oh, really? She gave it to you. Standard. Like 8 hours and 30 minutes.
You don't gotta take my word for it then. It is a joke.
If you don't want to be here, go.
It was a joke.
If you don't want to be here, go.
God, chill.
Don't tell me to chill. This is my classroom. If you're here to acquire knowledge to advance your future, then fine. If you're here because somebody makes you wake up and come down here so you can play baseball, then go. You don't have to be here, I promise you. Learn how to act like a college student.
Learn how to take a joke.
Goodbye.
I told
You're
you
gone.
it was a joke.
You're gone. You're gone. And I will be talking to your coach about your behavior.
You're a punk, dude. Tell him I said that too.
It said for me on my computer, it said not, I can't submit it online.
I fixed it so that everything can be submitted on Canvas. You must have tried more than 2 days ago, correct?
Yeah.
is about to erupt in New Orleans. Because of its strategic location at the mouth of the Mississippi River, the North targets Louisiana during the first year of the Civil War. A year after the war breaks out, Union soldiers occupy the state. 3 years later, James Madison Wells becomes governor of Louisiana. By 1866, Wells wants to give blacks the vote.
The decision to enfranchise African Americans by Republican politicians within New Orleans is a mixture of both idealism and of partisan calculation. No question about it that the Unionist leadership within New Orleans, many of whom are white Union Army veterans themselves, they look at the political landscape within Louisiana and they see that if the Republican Party is ever going to come to power, it's going to have to enfranchise African Americans.
Governor Wells supports a call for a state convention to be held in New Orleans on July 30th, 1866, at a large Union meeting hall called the Mechanics' Institute. The agenda? To make black suffrage a reality.
This is extraordinarily controversial and is deeply feared within the white population. And Wells is doing this because he fears that if nothing else is done, that Confederates will be back running the state of Louisiana within a matter of months.
By early 1866, many ex-rebels have already infiltrated the Louisiana state government. They are men like Mayor John Monroe, Attorney General Andrew Harrod, and Lieutenant Governor Albert Voorhees. All are determined to restore white supremacy to the state.
It's the coming of the state convention that really has the potential to throw a kind of a lighted match into a powder keg of conditions that are going to explode within New Orleans.
The ex-rebel leadership creates a deputized police force made up of hundreds of armed citizens to prevent the convention from taking place. There is, however, one obstacle to their plan: federal troops. On July 27th, 3 days before the convention, Lieutenant Governor Albert Voorhees sends a telegram to President Andrew Johnson asking whether federal troops will intervene. Johnson's reply to Voorhees sets the stage for murder and mayhem.
To Albert Voorhees, Lieutenant Governor of Louisiana, New Orleans, Louisiana. The military will be expected to sustain and not to obstruct or interfere with the proceedings of the court.
With the apparent blessing of the president and no federal troops in sight, the ex-Confederate leaders of New Orleans moved to carry out their plan. General Absalom Baird, commander of federal troops in Louisiana, sends a telegram to his superiors in Washington. He receives no reply.
What this does is it makes Baird very unsure about what it is he is actually supposed to do. Baird was a professional soldier. He was trying very much to stay out of the politics of this powder keg that was developing. He actually did not want to get involved, and that would ultimately be his downfall because he couldn't avoid it.
While Baird remains in New Orleans, he stations his troops at Jackson Barracks, 3 miles down the Mississippi River. This would prove to be a costly decision. Early on the morning of July 30th, 1866, about 150 white and black Union delegates convene at the Mechanics' Institute. Across the French Quarter of New Orleans, about 200 black Union Army veterans begin a freedom march, calling for the right to vote. During the Civil War, nearly 180,000 black men served in the Union Army, many of whom were escaped slaves from the South. While these black troops helped the North achieve victory and abolish slavery, their service did not guarantee them the right to vote.
They're essentially marching for freedom, marching for their own vote, arguing that because they fought in the Civil War, they should be allowed to vote. They demanded political rights. They demanded economic rights. They insisted that they were not going to be subordinate to white Southern planters the way that they had been when they were slaves. So part of this was a sort of a welling up on the part of African Americans who thought that they'd been liberated in the war and they were not going to be made into subordinate or second-class citizens again.
The parade makes its way up Burgundy Street toward the Mechanics Institute. Along the way, crowds of white men and women gather and berate the marchers.
When they cross the main street of New Orleans, which is Canal Street, right before they get to the meeting place, there is a growing and escalating number of incidents. Racial epithets are hurled back and forth. Bricks are thrown, bottles are thrown. Eventually, somebody takes out a pistol. They're not exactly sure even which side it was on, and shots are fired.
The New Orleans Massacre has begun. July 30th, 1866, New Orleans, Louisiana. About 200 black Union veterans begin a freedom march toward a building called the Mechanics Institute. Here, Union delegates debate the fate of black suffrage. Local ex-Confederate leaders opposed to the black vote have created a large police force to arrest the delegates at the convention.
Ex-Confederate leaders thought that they had assembled a very large police force that was so large that it was going to smother the state convention and that they were going to simply arrest everybody and take them off to jail. Well, as frequently happens in battle, the generals can give the orders. What the troops may do is something very different.
Outnumbered and outgunned, the black veterans attempt to enter the Mechanics Institute. The full police force attacks them from behind. The delegates inside watch in horror as the massacre unfolds. The scene is described in a passage from the House report on the New Orleans riots.
Colored persons at distant points in the city, peaceably pursuing their lawful business, were attacked by police, shot, and cruelly beaten. A colored man was dragged from under a street crossing and killed in a single blow. The dead bodies upon the streets were violated by shot, kick, and stab. The face of a man just breathing his last was gashed by a knife or razor in the hands of a woman.
Inside the Mechanics Institute, the delegates become the target of the insurgents' rage.
This force of New Orleans police officers, fire department members, and the sheriff's department begin battering down the doors of the meeting hall. Inside, some of them later said that they were hoping that they could keep out the ex-Confederates long enough until the Union Army comes. But what they don't know, of course, is that the Union Army is not going to participate in this fight.
General Baird finally orders his troops to New Orleans, but they're still 3 miles away at Jackson Barracks.
Eventually, the doors are battered down. People start jumping out of windows. People start trying to run to other parts of the building.
It is in evidence that men who were in the hall, terrified by the merciless attacks of the armed police, sought safety by jumping from the windows a distance of 20 feet to the ground, and as they jumped, were shot by police or citizens.
From there, the police force that had assembled starts chasing anyone who's African American or is white, for that matter, who's coming out of the building. And from there, it sort of degenerates into a hunt by the ex-Confederate forces for all of those who had had anything to do with the state convention at all.
By the time General Baird and the federal troops arrive, it is too late. The riot is over. All that is left is the carnage.
Baird immediately declares New Orleans under martial law, which the ex-Confederate leadership says there's no need for martial law here. We have everything well in hand. We've got all of the violence taken care of.
Officially, reports state that the mob kills over 50 people and severely wounds over 200. Many historians believe, however, that this number is much higher, as many bodies are carried off by friends or relatives and buried privately. In the weeks that follow, not one police officer, public official, or private citizen is indicted for their role in the massacre.
You have to stop for a minute and see how this has to hit a northern population just a year after the Civil War. Many of them had to wonder, is the Civil War really over in the South when it's not safe for Union veterans, be they black or white, to walk the streets of New Orleans or indeed to hold a political meeting? Or are they going to get assassinated? Are they going to get massacred? Are they going to be run out of town?
Anti-black violence erupts throughout the South, including Richmond and Norfolk, Virginia, Charleston, South Carolina, Montgomery, Alabama, Pensacola, Florida, Savannah, Georgia, and Memphis, Tennessee, where a mob butchers 50 former slaves and burns close to 100 black homes and churches to the ground.
They called it peace. It wasn't peace. People bloody and dead in the streets. These things happen scores of times throughout the South.
The impact is to convince an uncertain northern white population that Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction plan was an utter failure.
Despite the bloodshed and the criticism from the North, Johnson launches a speaking tour to defend his policies. But his long-rumored drunkenness becomes prominent as he sarcastically calls for the execution of leading radical Republicans and publicly blames Congress for the New Orleans massacre.
Andrew Johnson saw the world in terms of black and white. There was never any middle gray ground. You were either for him or against him, and that's part of the problem with this ongoing battle with the radical Republicans, was that Johnson had no politics in him. Yes, he was all those things. He was a drunken demagogue. He was an individual that had some terrible characteristics. But in the final analysis, Andrew Johnson basically protected the South against the more radical Republicans in the North.
I've wasted 20 minutes of your time. So again, Andrew Johnson was a Democrat from Tennessee. He had actually been an apprentice whenever he was young. In other words, his parents had sold him into involuntary servitude, and he escaped from that apprenticeship. And that was important in his formative years as establishing himself as a champion of his home state's honest yeomen. In other words, the people who actually had to work as opposed to the wealthy plantation owners. Whenever Tennessee seceded from the Union, Johnson was the only one who did not abandon his Senate seat. And as a result, whenever the Civil War progressed, Andrew Johnson was ultimately rewarded with an appointment as the military governor of the state during the North's occupation. And again, the big problem for Abraham Lincoln as he entered the election of 1864, the campaign of 1864, was that the Civil War was really not a popular war, and it was very likely that Lincoln was going to lose his bid for re-election. So in order to help Republicans show that they were willing to work with the South and that they were willing to work with Democrats, Lincoln made Johnson his running mate in a good faith show in order to bolster support not only from Democrats in the North, but as an olive branch that was going to be extended to the southern states if the war came to a close. Of course, what ends up happening is that Abraham Lincoln is assassinated just a few weeks into his second term, and Andrew Johnson, who was originally targeted in John Wilkes Booth's assassination plan, remember also attacked was William Seward, the Secretary of State, and Ulysses S. Grant was going to be a target if he had been in Washington, D.C., but he had left that Friday morning. So Johnson initiated a period known as presidential reconstruction, and the terms were just incredibly benevolent. A pardon was available to white Southerners who took an oath of allegiance to the United States. The exception was that the Confederate leaders, those who had actually served in the government or had been officers in the military, and if they had land holdings that were valued at more than $20,000 before the war, they actually had to apply to the president directly for an individual pardon. And those were pretty much rubber stamped out by Johnson's underling. All in all, whenever everybody who had feared or everybody who had called for the execution of the Confederate leaders, the Confederate politicians, the Confederate officers as those who had committed treason, there was actually only one Confederate leader, Henry Works, who oversaw the Andersonville prison, who was executed, and that was just because the atrocious conditions there clearly violated tenets of war. So Johnson, during his presidential reconstruction phase, appointed provisional governors and called on them to establish whites-only state conventions that would establish loyal governments to the South. Now, of course, that's immediately in breaking with the kind of reconstruction that Lincoln had offered, with the idea that blacks were going to have a say in the governance of the defeated Confederate states. Any other mandates were minimal. The state governments were obviously required to abolish slavery because that was a constitutional amendment at this time. They were supposed to repudiate secession, say, we're sorry we did it, we won't do it again. And the states were banned from paying off debts that the Confederate States of America government and military had acquired. But otherwise, they had a free hand in managing their state affairs, in managing their local affairs. And obviously, this is setting up a conflict between the Northern Republicans who say, no, this isn't okay. You can't just let the South off the hook like this. You do have to allow the blacks to have a say in their self-government. And most of the Confederate elite who were able, under this plan, to return to their positions of political power. There were also reports of government-sanctioned violence against the blacks, as we saw in the video, or just government indifference to those kinds of lynch mobs that were taking place. And that further angered Northern Republicans. When the South actually began to pass black codes, these new laws that were designed to regulate almost every aspect of a free black person's life, such as restricting the right to marry, the right to own property, again, denying them access to the courts whenever they were either accused of criminal matters or were being brought before the court on a civil matter. And when blacks were being, again, denied the right to testify in courts, to serve in juries, to be as part of state militias, or when these Jim Crow laws were being activated that kept them from voting, things like poll taxes. Well, if you couldn't afford to pay the poll tax, you couldn't vote. But poor whites were able to pay the poll tax because they were grandfathered in. The laws would say if your grandfather was eligible to vote without paying a poll tax, then you're eligible to vote without paying a poll tax. It was absolutely pure racism. And then any black who failed to have an annual labor contract to work on a plantation could be arrested, and then the government would hire them out to white landowners, white contractors, people who needed to do so. So essentially it was just slavery by another name. So when Congress reconvened in December of 1865, the Republican majority immediately said, we need to dissolve the state governments that Johnson has established. We need to bar ex-Confederates from being able to serve in government posts. And we need to make sure that blacks have the right to vote and are able to run for office. And these new leaders of this radical Republican movement, like Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, remember he got caned, and Representative Thaddeus Stevens from Pennsylvania, they actually sought to confiscate the lands of the Southerners who had rebelled against the states and redistribute it among freed blacks and migrants from the North. But ultimately, those ideas of taking land away from Southerners and distributing it to blacks were deemed to be even too radical for their fellow Republicans. Eventually, you have the Republicans in Congress establishing the first Civil Rights Act. In 1866, the Freedmen's Bureau was extended. It would only last another 4 years, though. The Republicans passed the Civil Rights Bill of 1866, which would have defined all persons in the United States as citizens and would have given citizens equal protection before the law. But Johnson vetoed both of those bills, and eventually they had to take the form of constitutional amendments in order to be sure that they could be a part of the U.S. Constitution, and in order for Americans to be secure in the fact that these freed slaves would be eventually on the path of receiving equal protection. The 14th Amendment states no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Originally designed to benefit the freed slaves, the 14th Amendment has become the most important amendment, maybe other than the First Amendment, in the U.S. Constitution. It's used to define and to determine the outcome of all types of cases of discrimination. The Obergefell versus Hodges case on whether or not states were required to recognize gay marriages, afforded by other states, came down to the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. When George Bush and Al Gore were going to court in 2000 over the Florida recount, and Al Gore wanted individual counties to be able to go through and count specific ballots that maybe somebody had punched but not punched through all the way. The Supreme Court said that that was an equal protection issue because there was not a uniform way for counting the votes. Therefore, George W. Bush's equal protection rights were being violated by the state's recount. It did not assure blacks the rights to vote, but it did establish that a state's representation in Congress and subsequently the Electoral College would be based on the registration of voters. So in order for these states like Georgia, which previously, before the war, I'm just throwing these numbers out here, they're not accurate, had maybe had 2.5 million white residents and 1.5 million slaves. Well, in order for them to have the full representation of 4 million people, that was going to be based on the voters' rolls. In other words, they had to allow blacks to register to vote in order for them to have the number of members of Congress that they were entitled to based on their population and the number of people, number of electoral votes that the state was entitled to based on its population. So that was a way to ensure that southern states that were reluctant to give blacks the opportunity to vote would be required to do so. But then, in the midterm elections of 1866, with many of the southern states still not able to send representatives to Congress and senators to Congress, the Republicans were able to take 2/3 majorities in both houses. And that meant that even if Johnson tried to veto a bill, Congress could override that veto And in doing so, Congress passed the Reconstruction Act in 1867 that divided the South into 5 military districts. In other words, armed forces from the United States were going to be sent to the South to protect the rights of blacks. It also called for the creation of new state governments that were going to give black men not only the right to vote, but also the right to serve in office. And this is the period of radical Reconstruction that lasted roughly a decade until essentially Americans got tired of it, and under which the biggest conflicts during the period of Reconstruction took place. But I know you don't want to take my word for it.
April 14th, 1865 is remembered as the night of Abraham Lincoln's assassination. But in Washington, it was an evening of general treachery. There were evil men about. Lincoln was shot. Secretary of State William Seward was stabbed. General Ulysses S. Grant was targeted, but was fortunately out of town. Vice President Andrew Johnson was on the hit list, too.
Johnson was offered tickets to attend the play at Ford's Theater, but turned them down. Probably a good thing.
But Lincoln assassin John Wilkes Booth knew exactly where the vice president would be spending the night. He assigned a co-conspirator to go to Johnson's suite at the Kirkwood boarding house.
Johnson retires to his quarters at the Kirkwood house. He's completely unaware of anything that's going on. In fact, sits up part of the night reading and goes to bed.
If all had gone according to plan, Johnson would have been awakened sometime later by a knock at the door, at which point a knife would have been plunged into his heart. But it never happened.
The man assigned by Booth to assassinate Johnson lost his nerve and started drinking, decided he wasn't going to do it.
So the vice president was spared, and when Lincoln died of his wounds the following morning, Andrew Johnson became the first American president to gain the office because of an assassin's bullet.
That's part of what evolved into Johnson's difficulties. He assumes the presidency. He was not elected to it. And so Johnson was coming in as virtually a pretender to the throne.
Number 17, Andrew Johnson, Democrat Union, 1865 to 1869, 56 years old, from Tennessee. Andrew Johnson was nothing like his martyred predecessor. Unlike Lincoln, he was a Southerner and a Democrat, and had at one point owned a small number of slaves. But during the Civil War, he was the only senator from a seceding state to remain with the Union, and he had been selected as Lincoln's running mate in 1864 to broaden the ticket's appeal.
Nobody anticipated at all Johnson becoming president. If anyone had thought that might possibly happen, they certainly wouldn't put him on the ticket.
Johnson was regarded as stubborn or principled, depending on whether you agreed with him or not. Like Lincoln, he had risen from poverty to prominence through his own determination.
This upward striving in Lincoln went along with the kind of wit and modesty and open-mindedness and ability to deal with all sorts of people. Somehow with Johnson, he has this closed-in personality. He's very self-oriented. He doesn't listen to other people. He doesn't care about other people. He doesn't have very many friends.
Johnson's background and personality greatly influenced his management style. He had no formal education and had trained to be a tailor. He also had a righteous streak.
Johnson was dogged and stubborn, inflexible. Once he took a position, he was never willing to compromise it. He has a tendency to see conspiracies on all sides against him. He was thin-skinned about criticism. So in all of these respects, he differed sharply from Lincoln.
For a model on how to run his new presidency, Johnson looked to a former president with whom he shared a home state and a very similar name, Andrew Jackson.
One of Jackson's great quotations is, "Our federal union must be preserved." And Johnson picked that up and used that throughout his career, and the argument can be made that he was the last Jacksonian.
Like Jackson, Johnson believed he was the voice of the common man, or at least the common white man.
Probably the most racist president we've ever had. And he thinks barbarians, and he really thinks they should just go back to work on the plantation and leave the public sphere to whites.
When Johnson took the oath of office, the Civil War was essentially over. Now it was up to the tailor from Tennessee to stitch the tattered Union back together. His entire legacy would be staked on the question of Reconstruction.
Well, I think the Reconstruction crisis was the greatest crisis in American history, other than the crisis of the Civil War itself. Because what was at issue was not simply bringing the South back into the Union, but defining the essence of the American nation. Who is going to be a citizen of the United States? What are the rights that citizens are to enjoy? Who is an American, basically?
Among the most eager to learn about Johnson's policies were the so-called radical Republicans, the vocal, reform-minded wing of the party. Men like Pennsylvania Representative Thaddeus Stevens and Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner. They believed the South should be punished and the freed slaves protected, made citizens, and given the right to vote.
Johnson played the role very skillfully in those first few weeks. And the immediate reaction is, yes, we trust Johnson, and we can deal with him. Then Congress leaves Washington not to come back again until December. So Johnson has that wonderful window of opportunity there to take over as president.
What Johnson did with his opportunity was to come up with his own presidential Reconstruction plan. Many in the defeated South were prepared for the worst.
In April 1865, the South lay prostrate at the feet of the conquering North, and many Southerners then were so shell-shocked that they would have been willing to accept almost any terms of Reconstruction. Johnson came in thundering revenge, punishment for these poor people, and in their despair, they thought, oh my God, this is what our fate is going to be.
But Johnson had a pleasant surprise in store for the dispirited Southerners.
They are a conquered region, but he doesn't want to treat them as a conquered region. These are his people, after all.
Nobody knows for sure what Lincoln would have done, but Johnson's plan favored amnesty for most ex-Confederates and quick acceptance of the seceded states into the Union. The freed slaves got little protection. They weren't guaranteed citizenship or the right to vote.
Johnson was on the wrong side of history, on the wrong side of morality, on the wrong side of politics. He just was unable to recognize that the Civil War had changed the nation, that the emancipation of the slaves carried with it some obligation to protect the basic rights of these emancipated slaves.
When Congress comes back to town in December of '65, Johnson announces that the restoration of the South has been completed. And that is startling news to the members of Congress.
Congress immediately started passing Reconstruction Acts of its own, beginning with an extension of the Freedmen's Bureau, a measure begun under Lincoln to aid the transition of blacks from slavery into freedom. Johnson vetoed it.
And from that point on, that will be the story of the relationship between Congress and the President. Congress passes, Johnson vetoes. Congress passes, Johnson vetoes.
Johnson's 29 presidential vetoes shattered the previous record of 12, which was set by his hero Andrew Jackson.
When you hitch your presidential leadership to the veto ladder, you're not going anywhere. And Johnson, stubborn and defiant that he was, refused to see that.
Now it was Congress's turn to make history. Beginning with the Civil Rights Bill of 1866, they realized they had the votes to override Johnson's vetoes. Their record of overturning President Johnson 15 times still stands. Throughout 1866 and 1867, Congress hammered away at Johnson's authority. In March of 1867, they passed the Tenure of Office Act, limiting the president's ability to remove appointees without the Senate's consent. It was a trap, and Johnson couldn't resist the bait. He suspended and later dismissed his Secretary of War, a holdover from Lincoln's cabinet.
Take no prisoners was his attitude. And of course, that inspired the other side to fight back in the same way, and that's why he was impeached.
Explain a little bit about what's going on here. So in March of 1867, Congress passes this new law, and it says that the United States President cannot remove certain office holders, including cabinet members, without the Senate's approval. Well, it's a completely unconstitutional bill. It would never stand up in the Supreme Court, but Congress passes it, Johnson vetoes it, and Congress puts it into law over Johnson's veto. Well, Johnson's a lot like Donald Trump. He's stirring for a fight. So in February of 1868, Johnson says, screw you, Congress, I'm firing the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. And Congress says, aha, we've got you. And so the House approves articles of impeachment, and he is impeached. Now, impeachment doesn't mean he's removed from office. Impeachment is what the House of Representatives does to say, we recommend that the President of the United States be removed from office because he has violated this law, and this law. And then that goes to the United States Senate. You only have to have 50% of the members of the House of Representatives approve articles of impeachment for a president to be impeached. But being impeached isn't the same as being removed from office. In order to be removed from office, more than 2/3 of the members of the Senate have to say, yes, that's true. These articles of impeachment, which the House have presented to us, are valid, and therefore the president must be removed from office. Well, while the Senate trial was taking place, Johnson's lawyers got together with a couple of moderate Republicans and said, look, his term's almost over. This was in August of 1868. He's going to be out of office in March of 1868. Just let him finish out his term. He's not going to run for re-election, so we really don't need to make a big deal out of this. And by one vote, Johnson is able to remain as president and continue his term of office, though he really didn't accomplish anything of significance during that final.
By violating the Tenure of Office Act, Johnson gave the radicals in Congress an excuse to get rid of him. Articles of impeachment were drafted.
Opposition only made him more and more stubborn. He was unwilling to meet his critics halfway. He was unwilling to listen to criticism. So he just destroyed his own presidency.
In February of 1868, the House of Representatives made an unprecedented move, voting to impeach the president. Their charges were flimsy at best and clearly politically motivated.
Johnson's the target of a vast left-wing conspiracy. He thought the impeachment was an outrage. He said the people who are violating the Constitution, impeaching me for violating the Constitution, should be the other way around.
A trial in the Senate would determine whether Johnson's misdeeds amounted to the high crimes and misdemeanors required by the Constitution to remove him from office. If 2/3 of the senators voted to convict him, the Johnson presidency would be over.
Tickets to this trial were like getting tickets to the Super Bowl. No, they were scalped outside the Senate chambers.
It was a matter of great entertainment. It was like a big athletic event.
It was the social event in Washington. And the women and all that finery and the diplomats, everybody came to the Senate to see what was going to go on.
It was a circus, just as it was in 1999.
In the end, Johnson avoided conviction and removal from office by a single vote. Chastened by his run-in with Congress, Johnson passed the rest of his term quietly. After returning home to Tennessee, he would later become the only former president to be elected to the Senate.
At the end of the day, you have to admit that he was no Abraham Lincoln. But who was? And Johnson lived with that shadow over him his entire tenure as president.
I think Johnson, in a way, discredited the presidency. His intransigence helped empower Congress to take a greater and greater role in formulating major national policy.
The troublesome relationship between Andrew Johnson and the Congress had a lasting impact on the executive office. For the next 40 years, a series of relatively weak presidents would occupy the White House. Andrew Johnson.
We will talk about the next presidents who occupy the White House, Ulysses S. Grant, and the end of Reconstruction on Friday. Don't forget to submit your essay on Canvas. It is due today. Have an amazing Wednesday. Thank you, sir.
Oh.
So it's not all for nothing. I actually, that you're a refresh
Good.
No, not today, man. Today's game day.
Nope. ¿Dónde está la oficina de